Hello and welcome back to Secret Diary. I'm your host, Arianna Ayala, and this is a podcast dedicated to discussing a range of topics. And today we are discussing some of my current reads. I'm really into reading about women's studies or just like women's experiences in general. I actually just finished reading Jane Eyre, and I think it's like one of my favorite books I've ever read. Um, So I definitely will be just talking. Okay, this is the lineup we have. We have Jane Eyre, which is like coming of age romance, in my opinion, but definitely it's standalone novel that's like very independent in itself, and it discusses like some of the first adaptations we have of the independence of women and kind of like a psyche into the mind of a woman who isn't subservient and is kind of more thought provoking and well rounded than a lot of the literature written about women at the time. And up next to that, I have Little Women. Very similar, but more coming of age, a little more traditionalist in, its ideas on marriage and the role of women in society. But this is also like a much simpler time when, and with class as a huge issue behind both of these wonderful stories is like something I really took away and could relate to. The next are more nonfictions. The first one is The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan, which is kind of a name to a problem that was becoming more prevalent as women were entering the workforce and some women were opting to continue their lives as stay-at-home mothers but found themselves struggling with the kind of fixed purpose of raising children, of being kind of painted this more traditionalist role in the household, and kind of a study on the issues that women were having when it came to mass, like they called it hysteria. I think it was more so just like the lack of feeling true purpose and respect for the work that stay-at-home mothers were doing at the time, especially as women were entering the workforce and kind of toggling between career and household work and kind of able to integrate that into their lives as well. And then I'm not done with it yet, but I'm currently reading um, Sexual Personae, I think that's how you pronounce it, by Camille Paglia, which I'm pretty sure she's kind of like a theorist, a philosopher of sorts. Seems more like an art critic, but she definitely has like really interesting takes on some of the classic art that has, kind of led renaissances, has shifted like through literature, and we get like so many strong standout authors that she's kind of digging into the sexuality and the promiscuity of their work, and kind of how it's plagued by how sexuality is and sex just kind of plagues a worldview, an inner world that is broken apart through naturalistic instinct and more of like a human instinct, something that's like more conscious and transcendent. So I want to tie all these books together because I feel like I often will read things in progressive, like this topic. Oh, I really like this. I want to read more something that's just like a little bit less like nonfiction and more novel esque and more story oriented, and then I'll get out of a story and then I'll really want to like dig into like the psychology, the philosophies about the ideas that are like going on throughout the book. So I'm kind of going off a rip here. I don't really have like a structure. I just think these are some really great books that I've been reading, and um, kind of doing myself a service by letting my thoughts be analoged in the process, as like I finished most of these and I don't have a lot of people in my life that I can share like books I read with. So it is nice to be able to pick up and use the pod as an outlet for me to just kind of rant about all of these books and my thoughts. So I think I'll probably start with the one I've read the furthest back, which is Feminine Mystique. I've actually took a break from reading this. I got it back in like 2021 and I read the first like 3 chapters, put it down, and like I was also reading Woman, Race, and Class by Angela Davis at the time. So it was something that was like definitely on my reading list, definitely on my radar, but I just think I got really sucked in to more like race and class centered books that I kind of put down the women's studies for a second. Excuse me while I let my cat out of the room, even though she begged to come in here before I started filming this, but we'll continue anyway. But yeah, so the feminist mystique really covers like a very condensed and I wouldn't say it was very like wide range. It's definitely like centered on white suburban middle class women who during like the 1950s when the women's suffrage movement and tandem with the civil rights movement is making a lot of big waves, and we get these huge kind of shifts in culture where women are working, women have more power, but obviously like socially, where does that leave women who kind of don't want the to fit into this new power, into this new structure, who are more than happy being stay-at-home moms? Where does that kind of leave them in the mix? What are the things that they're dealing with? What are their issues, right? Because a lot of the time a lot of the time during this time, some of the strongest voices we were hearing were the problems of, the women who were clearly unhappy in their roles and wanting to break out of that. So they wanted to be, pursuing careers, pursuing kind of like passions outside of the home and the household. Being homemakers was on the outs. And so that's obviously because of this, we get this wonderful book that kind of will go off into sections on different problems, discussing the problem that has no name is kind of how it's presented as itself. But Betty Friedan gives it the name The Feminine Mystique, which is all these housewives that, have just opted into doing these roles, kind of giving themselves this responsibility of being stay-home mothers. And they're unfulfilled and they don't feel a purpose in their work anymore after people have gone off and women have made these huge strides to have the same rights as men, to be able to pursue education, to be able to get into like career fields. Obviously this is like early days, but this is a huge shift for everyone in America, and at the time we're getting to really break and dig into this like weird problem. These women, these stay-at-home moms, are anxious and depressed and find no purpose in their work, and they get into like a mass hysteria, and a lot of them will spend hours and hours doing household work because they feel as if it's their role in their job, like they don't have hobbies and they don't have interests, so they kind of are case studies. They're very interesting case studies for like early days of kind of like the role and the psychology that women were indoctrinated into having simply because of like the patriarchal structures that were being upheld prior to women's rights to vote and to work and to access education. And even in these moments, women's education, women's careers were still being facilitated by men in bulk. And a lot of the women who had these opportunities for education, for higher level careers, were very much coming from wealth and were getting funneled educations through generational wealth. And then, there's the less popular stories of the people who kind of like needed to work. They were already working prior to all of this, but it was mostly like sex work, or it was just like waitressing. These are just like not like didn't it wasn't really like a choice. It was more out of instinct and survival. So now we have women who, given the opportunity, still choose to stay at home and suffer, feeling like their lives lack a purpose once their children come of age where they no longer need like their moms to stay at home and do everything for them. For me, this is like a really interesting deep dive, and it really made me like empathize and sympathize with women who nowadays still kind of carry on these traditional roles and they enjoy them, but it's kind of like a choice. It's like a liberating choice because they want to do these things. As somebody who is like queer and doesn't really like subscribe to most traditionalist values, it's really difficult to place myself in the mindset of somebody who might find themselves like feeling anxious and depressed in this environment and like wanting to stay in it. Like, I don't, for me, it was like a difficult read in that because I feel like a lot of the problems that the stay at home moms were having in like the 50s, based off like, electronics and technology and all these developments where they were like getting, it was just a lot easier to maintain your home. And it was becoming a lot clearer that there was no need for you to stay at home all day and clean and to just like do household things if like you didn't need to do it. It was certainly like you could do it. And there was like a lot of examples of women taking like hours to do stuff that like women who were in the workforce were taking like an hour to do, and feeling fulfilled in their lives and having lives outside of the home. And it really just makes you question like this new wave. For me, it makes me question like this new wave of traditionalist mindset where women don't want to work. They just want to be like princesses within their relationships, and they just, I mean, I'm not going to fault you. I don't want to work either. I don't really think that's like the bigger problem here. I guess so, more so it's about like what are people indulging in if they're not working? What are the people consuming and using their time for? And is it fulfilling to them? Like, is it something that for them feels like worthwhile? And I guess for me, it's like that answer is completely like perception based and it's individual. You, I couldn't tell you like how something might be unfulfilling to you if it truly is fulfilling. Like, just for me, I would not feel fulfilled in the kind of like more traditional relationship where somebody's like the breadwinner and the other one's like the homemaker. I think for me, ideologies around this make it feel almost like it's like a form of trade off in the form of compromise, because most of the times in these situations, obviously I'm referencing like the feminine mystique, women didn't have lives outside of the home. Like, they could go and join like a club, or they could be on like a PTA possibly, but when they were home it felt like a drowning existentialism of like, what is my purpose? Like, if I'm not helping and contributing to society beyond my helping raise my children, what is my purpose? And I think nowadays you have like the complete like almost like a radical shift in ideologies where it's like women who are deciding to be stay-at-home mothers feel like that is their sole purpose, feel like that is the most fulfilling for them. But I don't really talk to too many women in this position, so I would also love to hear like, are these still problems that women are facing? I'm sure there are. I mean, depression, anxiety rates are like through the roof in America in general, simply because of just like the state of capitalism. We're in like a late stage capitalistic point in society where we're being socialized to overconsume to compensate for the lack of mental health awareness that we're being given, like for the lack of rest period. I mean, I feel like everyone I meet, myself included, is like chronically overwhelmed, chronically like feeling as if the time we're not using is wasted when we choose to like relax or not completely like complete everything off a to-do list and bucket list. And I certainly feel the pressure. So reading through this book definitely helps me kind of like consider like what it is that me, like, as in my walk through life, like as a woman, like how I cannot relate to this dream. I cannot relate to this problem. But it's through experiences, through women who speak out about their experiences, like many of these housewives, that we get to break down like these psychological barriers to living in a patriarchy and upholding a patriarchy to some capacity. I know plenty of women who, regardless of their ambitions and dreams to have children, have come to me and been like, I would, I think I'm thinking about being a stay-at-home mom. And then, a few months later, I'm getting like phone calls and existential, fears of like, but I feel like what, like I'm not doing anything with my life if I'm just a mother. And I think this book really challenges like being a mom is not a sole identity. You carry a plethora of identities and roles and characteristics within you throughout your life, and sometimes those things will always change. But I guess for some, it's like motherhood seems like such a huge part of their life that they look forward to, that they don't know how to move on and adopt new roles once you've done like the bulk of your task as a mother and raising your children. And even within those, within that time period, you are not, should not be the sole responsibility of raising your children. It takes a village, it takes community. True parenting is not done just by the parents, it's done by an entire community of individuals coming together to raise future generation. So this book definitely touched really deeply to me about like the importance of organizing and facilitating like household work and identity and motherhood. As somebody who doesn't want children but still like feels very strongly about the responsibility we have for children. And I have a nephew. I'm an what is it? I'm an aunt. Yeah, I'm an aunt, and I can't imagine leaving this bulk of raising a child on the task of my sister-in-law. Like, that is ridiculous to me. It doesn't make any sense. So this is definitely a beautiful read. um it's obviously like very specific about like a specific experience. It doesn't really dig into a lot of the things, which is why I set it down when I first read it, because I was like super consumed with Women Race in Class by Angela Davis, which is like an amazing book, totally worth reading if you're into women's studies. But moving along, I think I'll dip into one of the novels I read that kind of touches a little bit on this problem that would go over in the feminine mystique. It's Little Women. So if you never read Little Women, it's a coming of age novel, and it's a story of a group of, I think it's 4 or 5 sisters. You have Jo, Amy. Off the top of my head, that's like the most I can think of. But Meg, who else is in here? There's also, I think, one more sister, the eldest sister, Beth, I believe. Yes, and these sisters who are living, I think, oof, I should probably have done like my digging into this, but it's older, it's an older book. We're still in times where like I think it's during one of the wars, World War II, I believe it's set in. You can cross reference me on this. I'm not 100% sure on the timeline. I just know it's like around a war. It's right around there, right? So we're looking at this coming of age story about a group of sisters who are poor, who at some point, I believe, had wealth and then lost their wealth. Their dad is drafted and is at war, and these women, instead of going to school to pursue educations, they decide to stay home to help take care of their land and their property with their mother. And we get like this beautiful coming of age story about women and their desires and their goals, but a lot of them revolve around this, very linear path, find a man, get married, have children, life fulfilled. And I think that there isn't this for me was such a realistic read because there's definitely like things about the story that make more sense to me when I'm kind of trying to grasp like what is it that fulfills like um this kinship with like being a mom and being a mother. And the the mother isn't really like a main character in the story, but she's certainly like a glue, a strong structure within the story that comes in to teach us like a poignant lesson when some of the girls are in fights, or we're kind of getting these questions about identity and purpose beyond that of marriage and children. So we have like Joe, who is super like tomboyish, and she is very against the idea of marriage, very against the idea of love, and she actually despises the thought of her sisters going off to marry because she thinks that their life that they have now is just so fulfilling and so enriching, and she couldn't imagine it any other way. I think this for me is like what really like felt so like such a beautiful part of this reading experience is truly feeling the sense of connection and harmony within the family, just and the lack of men around them is certainly like its own contributing factor to like this more like a effeminate and nurturing energy, but still like feeling these whirlwinds of masculinity through, a lot of those like dominant roles need to be taken up by the women in the household, because there is no head of household, there's no man here. Then as some other supplemental characters that are just as important is Laurie and his grandfather. Laurie is a young boy who's like around the same age as Joe, and he is wealthy. He lives with his grandfather. I'm pretty sure he's orphaned. His mother was a musician. She died, and then shortly after his father died, I believe, and he was left to his vices with his grandfather. So here we get like an amazing tale of friendship. It certainly does kind of dig into the nuances of friendship and how sometimes like feelings can develop. And, when you're kids, like everything feels so like right in front of you, and it's hard to fathom like the idea of a future. But with somebody who has wealth, when everything is planned out for them, we have Laurie, whose life is kind of drawn out for him. His grandfather kind of has a plan for him, but you know Laurie is a writer. He is a poet. He loves the arts. He is a creative. He has suffered through, the death of his parents, and he finds like true kinship in somebody like Joe, who is non-traditionalist in her ideas and in her views, and she truly like we find this beautiful friendship of just like two kind two individuals who kind of challenge traditional gender roles in their identities and who they are. And I certainly like loved being able to dig into this more feminine side of a young boy and kind of getting to see the emotions and like the struggle between like this identity of like what it is to be a man and what it is to be a woman. It's definitely like a challenging and strong theme throughout the story that is constantly reinforced by the struggles and kind of like the climaxes of like issues throughout. And one of my biggest takeaways was the end, and I wasn't like too happy about the ending. I think it just circled a little bit too strongly on, marriage and casting people away. But like for the time, I'm sure that this was like such a relatable like piece of literature, and it was such like an incredible thing to be able to even contemplate and ruminate on things and ideas outside of this like very linear life path. But a lot of these questions on life and death and love are brought up through, I think it's when Beth gets sick, one of the eldest sisters. She gets what could be it wasn't a plague, it was just like it was, I think, tuberculosis, something that at the time would have been deathly. And they send the youngest Amy away to go live with their rich aunt. And we also get these like um moments in the story where a lot of the characters like they're so flawed in themselves, and I love a good flawed character. I think there's nothing more enjoyable than seeing pieces of yourself that you struggle with like within the characters of a story that is just like constantly letting you transform with it as it unfolds. It's a little slower paced, like not a lot of time passes. So I also think it's kind of sweet in that because it feels like very slice of life. And I was definitely able to like slow down and like be in moments with characters. And as somebody who does enjoy writing and does enjoy storytelling, it was so easy for me to visualize and so easy for me to feel like in scenes and in moments. I've yet to watch the movie, but I think it really like highlighted bits of like the feminine mystique for me in ways that I kind of get this cross hatching of like traditionalist roles, but also feeling like kinship, feeling like familial, like relations before you're put in that position. And I can only imagine the isolation and the loneliness that some of these housewives would feel when your whole life you're kind of surrounded by family. In some cases, you know, we can't speak for every housewife that was like interviewed and like psychoanalyzed in the feminine mystique, but in this story, right, you have sisters who are growing up in such a loving environment and they don't have a lot and they're willing to give the little that they do have, and they're, you know, incredibly like they have hobbies and interests and things that spark life for them, and yet they're waiting. Their biggest anticipation is, you know, to be married off, to find somebody to love, which I'm not. I'm a sucker for romance, but certainly not to the extent where it's like a part of my personality in a way where it would just like it would shadow over my interests and my passions that are standalone and, you know, and not something that I need to necessarily a partner to fulfill. But at the time, you know, because women were just kind of boxed in roles as like you need to get married in order to be purposeful, to have children, or, you know, you won't be able to live on your own. You will have to stay at home. You couldn't, like, you know, be off by yourself. You would need like a man to find some form of independence. So this story was certainly a really amazing read, and I really enjoyed um, kind of getting taken along for the ride. Moving on to Jane Eyre, which I've read more recently, so hopefully I have a way better analysis. I'm sorry for like having like really kind of bad breakdowns of these books. It's been like a little bit since I've read them. I've definitely just been again, I don't have anyone to talk to about like the books that I read. It's truly like disheartening, but I should probably join a book club sooner or later. I just, you know, I don't know too many people that still like to read, unfortunately. Or like most of the people that I do know like to read like will make content online, but I really struggle with social media, so it's really hard for me to like be online and talking on like through channels and forums because I do a lot of my schoolwork online and through like the internet, and a lot of like my organizing work as well. Like I'm kind of constantly have to be tapped in to orgs and networks, so I'll get like a lot of my news sources like from that, and just like general updates on like labor movements and campaigns. So it's like been really difficult for me to find the balance of like where I can enjoy and consume responsibly online, but maybe if I was like on book side of the internet, all my problems would disappear. So, yes, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I think this is quite literally one of the best books I've read in my entire life, probably. I just love a good independent woman, and this story is just that. You know, Jane Eyre is an orchid child. And if you know anything about psychology, orchid child and orchid children are children who thrive in terrible environments purely out of a means of instinct and survival. They are outspoken. They're brave, courageous, and they will take any and all opportunities to put themselves in a position better than the last. And despite all this, still choose kindness, still choose perseverance, kind of adopt this role to be a fixer upper, almost like the role self of needing to fix things for others because they're too helpless to help themselves, which is not true. And a fixed role. Jane Eyre is kind of placed in a setting where at first I was like, I kind of think I know where this is going, and then I just completely was shocked by. I didn't read anything about it before. I like very, very rarely, if ever, will actually like spoil a book for myself. I don't think. I think I've survived pretty much this far, like not spoiling a book for myself that I've read. Besides Dune, I totally spoiled Dune for myself because I just could not keep reading at the pace that these movies were coming out because I'm not huge on like sci-fi, so it's so hard to get into like the world building of it. I still even haven't finished the first book, so that's on me. It's harder for me. I'm such a like slice of life nonfiction. Those are things I can like breeze through. Sci-fi, I gotta like do some real deep seated reading because I need to know what is going on. I need to understand everything. If not, it's just like I feel lost throughout the story. Um, so that's totally side tangent. But yeah, Jane Eyre, we get an orphan Jane. It starts, the first half of the book has her living with her abusive aunt, and that's where we kind of get a first splash in at her identity and her defiance, her natural defiance. And she's suffered, she's been through a lot. She is living in an environment where she's not wanted and nobody is standing up for her. And again, comments on class. Jane is poor and she's living with her rich aunt and her spoiled brat cousins who abuse her. And any moment she gets to defend herself and stand up for herself, she is deemed as ungrateful and entitled. Talk about life. Talk about literally the way all working class people are treated when they complain about the structures and system that upholds our own oppression. So Jane gets sent off to a boarding school for orphans, and it's like heavily religious, if I remember. I think it's Catholic school. Super strict rules, really like terrible environment. You're like waking up the ass crack of dawn, eating like bread and bean every day. If you're lucky, you're like basically these children are malnourished and they're being expected to excel in school somehow. Most of them not. Most of them are just like above average students, but Jane soon proves herself to be extremely intelligent and creative and talented. And kind of just thrives in this environment. She's given a second chance. It definitely feels like this is something that is instilled in her character throughout the book, is this idea of rebirth and renewal, as in the midst of hardship, in the midst of like in a system that is stacked against you, like still choosing to thrive and to do your best to persevere above your station, above people who have it even better opportunities than you, right? So Jane also is a witness to death, like at a very young age. One of her best friends in the school dies, really in her arms. It's beautiful. Like the writing in this book is spectacular. It is gorgeous. It just is straight like lyricism, milk and honey. It's poetry. There's just like so many excerpts throughout this book that I just was like, wow, I just want to go sit in a meadow and a field, and that's it. I just want to be in tranquility and peace and in a meditative state because of how beautifully written like the scenery and the landscapes were throughout this novel. So I'm really skipping through like the orphan boarding school bits. I mean, please read this book. Like, it is amazing. Please read it. But just to get to the bulk of like my ideas, explanations, so I'm not here for like an hour. But right, she leaves the school after becoming a teacher there, so she's there for like I think until she was like 18, 19, and then she puts out an ad illegally in one of the papers for a job, and she becomes a governess. I think that's what they're called. A teacher. She becomes a teacher for a young girl. She replies to an ad seeking like a teacher, and she goes. She is surprised when the person who puts out the ad actually isn't like the governess of the estate, but it just so happens to live there. Now that she's there and she lives there and she's teaching, she kind of is really just enjoying her life there. She's like, this is amazing, this is wonderful, but I've yet to meet like the estate owner, the man, Mr. Rochester, who owns this estate. And this is kind of where the story takes a turn from a hard focus of like coming of age, kind of like trials, tribulations, and journeyman into more of a romance where we see the relationship between Mr. Rochester, who's like, I think 40. I know. It's not looking hot right now, but he's like 40, Jane's like 19, 20, I think, and they start having conversations. Mr. Rochester comes off like kind of he's giving like spectrum coded man, but I don't want to assume because it's like not outwardly said, but it is said that he's like awkward in mannerism. He's like a little like kind of he says what he's thinking off the top of his head, but is this like a man quality like because of his own ego, or is it like, neurodivergence, unsure, speculative. I mean, we'll never know probably, but he's just like a little bit headstrong in his approach, but he also just speaks like very robustly in bursts of energy. Him and Jane talk a lot about just like opinions and ideas because she went to such a terrible school. He certainly has a great time just talking out of his ass, talking about all his journeys and interests and ideas, and Jane obviously not knowing any better, just like indulges because like a wiser man, you're telling me all these things. But she certainly challenges his behavior towards her, and the way he kind of treats her initially as like this subservient woman, it quickly changes into like, you are my friend, you are my confidant, you are somebody that I see as an equal. All of this kind of snowballs when Mr. Rochester starts looking to be wed, and Jane realizes that she is slowly developing feelings, and she feels unsure if Mr. Rochester feels similarly. So we kind of get this cute will they, won't they moment, but it seems a lot like a won't they because he's literally having like his rich friends come stay like weekends, doing like crazy party tricks for all of them, and very clearly flirting with like this really beautiful singer who is very wealthy. And obviously in this and in all cases, right, aren't they all just marrying for wealth and better opportunity? But there comes a night when he's hosting one of his lavish parties with his rich friends that we get a scene where there's a gypsy, a fake gypsy, I think we come to find out later. But, a gypsy's in this room saying she wants to read people's fortunes and tell them, like, who they will marry, and being very, like, suspicious and refusing to see any of the men. Jane is like invited to be at these parties, but she doesn't engage, and none of the other rich people in the room even bother to talk to her. They think she's just the help. She's there to just sit and watch the child that she's been teaching. So a lot of these interactions are based off of Jane's like perception and observation of the environment around her, which is like a part of the book that I really love. We really get to see the way Jane sees the world. She kind of sees it for what it is. Maybe a little nihilistic in moments when it comes to like her self image. She really does know that these people see her as less than. She doesn't act like she's less than in moments where she does get chances to speak, but she certainly does feel this class disparity throughout any and all interactions with the higher wealthier class that she has to converse with through Mr. Rochester. So within this, I really do feel like we get a decent poking the bear about, the out of touch reality that rich people live in and the bubble that they live in, and how they kind of don't see people who are poor as human as them, the whole shebang. But nonetheless, after this gypsy comes in here, she asks to see Jane. Like, she says, like, there's one more woman in here. All the other women are clearly like, no, there's not. There's just like the maid, the help. She's not woman. She's not us. But Jane goes anyway, and we find out later it's Mr. Rochester. He's fucking around. He's trying to get Jane to admit that that she likes him. Classic man playing games. Instead of just asking with his fucking both of them just confessing their feelings, they're just playing games here. But here we get a confession, and Mr. Rochester actually reciprocates Jane's feelings and is like, yeah, I really like you too. I love you. Let's get married. Even though he's set to marry this singer, it becomes messy real quick. He kind of is able to get rid of his old marriage, and then, we get Jane and Mr. Rochester sneaking away, being all like kitschy, trying to get married. Suddenly, like, they're outed to like the other people at the estate, the other workers. Miss, I'm not gonna remember her name for the life of me. Well, for now, we'll just call her Miss Fairy. Miss Fairy, the woman who made the ad in the paper that Jane answered initially, is really wary of this relationship. She doesn't like the age gap. She doesn't like that Jane is, working at the estate, and that's like the relationship was based off of, like working for one another. The power imbalance. There's like a power here that we kind of can dig into as well. But this is like a very like moral flaw that Jane holds in throughout the book, is kind of like not seeing when she is being taken advantage of, and using her skills to be able to have been taken advantage of in the past and still like be successful, as kind of like negligence to stand up for herself in situations where she's clearly being mistreated. But again, this is kind of more rhetoric on how women are expected to, take the smallest crumb and call themselves full. So we see it in Jane's character in this kind of perseverance through the trivial, through the benign. Her and Mr. Rochester end up not getting married because he has another wife, T, a schizo wife in the attic, which I'm sure like she was just severely mentally ill, but he just was saying she's like plagued by a demon. Ridiculous. They probably just did not have resources to help the mentally ill back then, but whatever. So Jane flees, and she goes and she starves herself for like days trying to find work, and she finds herself with priests, with this in this really small town where the priests and his sisters live in this house, and we later come to find out that they're Jane's extended family, extended relatives, or like second cousins or something. Jane gets some kind of inheritance when her uncle dies, and she gets it from Miss Fairy after she's like sending like telegrams and like newspaper ads around like neighboring villages trying to get a hold of her. And obviously, Jane leaves actually in the night. She does not tell Mr. Rochester, like, I don't want to marry you. She just leaves. So we kind of do get this, like, thinking for herself finally moment, this, like, clairvoyance. But this is soon over when Jane is at this new place, this new village. She's working as a teacher, helping the priest who is now, their cousins. And they start forming a weird relationship as well, where he's like, please marry me because you're so smart and intelligent, and I need to get married to somebody that I could use, like, if like you have let me like teach you that of the word, because she like takes on some studying. She learns languages with him. She's like constantly trying to learn, take advantage of her opportunity, and always putting herself in a terrible position because, these men always have hidden agendas throughout this book, is just like a theme. So once this priest, forgive me for not remembering his name, like I don't know why, but when I was reading, it was just giving me like Ben Affleck vibes for some reason. Like I just maybe he play him in the movie or something, but he goes off to India, I believe, and Jane responds to an ad, right? I don't think that's the way it goes. I think Jane just ends up hearing and finding out Mr. Rochester is living somewhere because she goes to his estate when she like flees because she's not trying to marry her cousin. Finds out like he doesn't live there anymore. It's been burned. It was burned by like the wife of the estate owner, and she's like, "Oh, okay." She was like going insane. She burned everyone down. She died in the building. So she goes to find Mr. Rochester, and he's like handicapped and disfigured from the fire, and he can't see. He's like blind. She calls out to him. They meet again. She's still in love with him. They make it work. It's not about how you look. It's about what's in your heart. Yada yada. It was good. It was beautiful, and I loved it. Definitely great as somebody who just like loves ruminating and kind of digging into stories about this, especially about womanhood and about fighting and taking down these terrible stereotypes that women have to be these subservient beings, or that like their only purpose in life is to be wed and to be somebody's like, nah. Jane got an inheritance. She was an independent woman. She was down bad in moments, aren't we all? But she certainly is headstrong in herself, and she makes the decision for herself to marry Mr. Rochester and to live the rest of her days with him. So that was beautiful, and I really recommend. So moving on really quick, I've already been yapping for 46 minutes about books. I could probably go for days, but I'm trying to be like quick. So right now, this is the book I'm reading, Sexual Personae. I think this is how you pronounce it. I'm not gonna harp on it too bad. I'm not finished reading it, but here we get breakdowns of a lot of very amazing pieces of art that I personally, as somebody who took like so many art history classes, like she's crazy. Paglia, I'm gonna say that's how you pronounce her name, is based. Her takes are really interesting. She certainly sees shit in ways that has me laughing and looking at like things that normally I would not sexualize, and just like completely like gagged because this girl was on something when she was writing this book. She talks on tangents and in circles for miles long. I just finished reading the chapter on Shakespeare, and chef's kiss. It was the first chapter. I was like, okay, maybe she's not insane. Maybe there is something to be said about the way Shakespeare wrote about women and how three-dimensional he made them seem. And how in a lot of Shakespeare's plays we get a lot like there is no binary. Men are playing women, women are playing men, and a lot of times throughout the film, throughout his plays, they would just completely gender swap, and it was just a true Dionysius like depiction of like indulgence and of decadence in art, and how the things that we see have been thought before and have influence, but this is certainly not like based actually in anything. This is all theoretical. This is all her perception after like studying art. I feel like it's truly more of like a critique on art than it is on like women's roles in art and how they're depicted. It certainly does have that kind of like taste or like tit for tat in moments, but it's not like huge central theme. It's not like very well integrated, I would say, but I really do enjoy like the parts that I have gotten through. The first two chapters for me were like bulky and hard to understand, but I guess it's kind of important for building on the framework that she goes into and like how she kind of breaks down pieces of art. I love art like history, so for me it's just like that is like the bulk of what I get out of it. It just feels like we're critiquing art, we're kind of taking our own interpretations. Nothing is set in stone, so this I will probably do like a full review once I'm done, and I'll actually like sit down and write about it, because I this is all off rip and off dome. So sorry if it seems like out of the it's not very consolidated thoughts. I think this is just more fun for me. If anything, it was definitely not meant to be like actual video essay. Not my segue in this department. But we're stretching on like 50 minutes of me talking about books. So I'm gonna end it here, and I'm gonna say thank you so much if you listened this far. I'm Ari. This is my book breakdown of the past few months. Thank you so much, and I will see you next time on Secret Diary. Bye.